Hi everyone, I hope you had a good weekend. Welcome to Supply and Demand. The supply and demand curve, or supply and demand model, is arguably one of the most familiar and most popular models in the study of economics. And as we go through this exercise and tomorrow's, I think you'll have a good sense of why. First of all, in the supply and demand model, there are really five key elements that we need to understand. The first is a demand curve, which we will go over tonight. The second is a supply curve, which we'll go over tomorrow night. The third is the set of factors that cause the demand curve to shift and the set of factors that cause the supply curve. The fourth is the market equilibrium, including equilibrium, easy for me to say, price and equilibrium quantity, basically where the supply and demand curves meet. The fifth is the ways the market equilibrium changes when the supply curve or the demand curve shifts, and we'll get into that in a few days. Very important point to remember as we get into this is that in a competitive market, no individual's actions have a noticeable effect on the price at which a good or service is sold, meaning that no individual's actions, so demanding an increase in price, demanding a reduction in price in a perfectly competitive market, won't have any impact on the price at which that good or service is sold. Let's get right into demand. So the demand schedule is a schedule or a curve that shows the various amounts of a product that consumers are willing and able to purchase at each of a series of possible prices during a specified period of time. So here in this example we have a demand schedule for, let's call it corn. So on the left hand side you see here prices per bushel, and on the right you see the quantity demanded per week. So this says that at $5 per bushel, consumers will demand 10 bushels per week. At $4, they'll demand 20 bushels a week. At $3, 35 bushels a week, and $2, 55 bushels a week. Now, if you put this into our graph here, and you'll see this is a demand graph, you'll notice that if we match those up, 5 and 10, 4 and 20, 3 and 35, and 2 and 55, what you get is something that looks like a curve, looks like this. And in this case, what we have just derived is a demand curve. So generally speaking, a demand schedule shows up looking like a chart like this. A demand curve will end up looking in something like this. Now, that again is a simple combination of the various prices consumers will pay for different quantities of a product, how much they will demand. The table does not tell us which of the five possible prices will actually exist in the corn market. That depends on the interaction between demand and supply, which we will see later. For right now, demand is simply a statement of the buyer's plans or intentions with respect to the purchase of a product. Before we move on, let's talk about the law of demand. The law of demand states that other things being equal, or ceteris paribus, as we've mentioned before, as price falls, so you see here along this side of the curve, as price falls, the quantity demanded rises here along the x-axis. So in short, there is a negative or inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded. This negative relationship is what economists call law of demand. So why is there an inverse relationship between the two? There are really three reasons. First, law of demand is sort of consistent with common sense. People ordinarily do buy more of a product at a low price than at a high price. Price is an obstacle that deters consumers from buying. If prices are really high, consumers will buy less of it. If you think about it just in your own world, if a Chipotle burrito goes to $10, you'll buy fewer of those burritos than you will at $5. The fact that businesses have sales is evidence of their belief in the law of demand. They lower prices on products, especially when they want to move them out the door. Second, there's an inverse relationship because each buyer of a product will derive less satisfaction, something we'll call benefit or utility, from each successive unit of the product consumed. So as I consume more and more of a product, my utility or the benefit that I derive decreases. Think of the first Big Mac you eat, if you eat Big Macs, first Big Mac, the second Big Mac, the third, the fourth, the fifth. Each successive unit that you consume gives you less and less benefit or utility. In economics, we call that the law of diminishing marginal utility. We can also explain the law of demand in terms of income and substitution effects. So there are two things going on here. The income effect indicates that at a lower price, that lower price increases the purchasing power of a buyer's money, meaning that they can buy more of that product than before. A higher price has the opposite effect. The substitution effect suggests that at a lower price, buyers have the incentive to substitute what is now a less expensive product for similar products that are now relatively more expensive. So think of the relationship between prices of products. So for example, a decline in the price of chicken will increase the purchasing power of consumer incomes, enabling people to buy more chicken. At a lower price, chicken is relatively more attractive, and consumers tend to substitute it for other kinds of food. So, beef, lamb, pork, or fish. So, think of that as the substitution effect. Let's talk now about changes in the demand schedule. So, there are two ways that the demand schedule or demand curve can change. The first is change in quantity demanded, and the second is change in demand. So if we look at this graph here, it doesn't matter what the product is, when we move from quantity A to quantity B, we're talking about movement along the initial demand curve, which I'm calling demand curve D. A to B, that movement is a change in the quantity demanded. So think of it this way. A change in quantity demanded, what we're calling movement along the demand curve, happens when changes in the price of a good result in the change in the quantity demanded. For example, and I put two here, first, an increase in the price of airline tickets usually results in a decrease in the quantity of airline seats demanded. So if I go from here, I'm looking at a quantity demanded right here along the x-axis. If the prices increase, you see movement here, you're going to see a decrease in the quantity demand. Second example, a decrease in the price of a bottle of water will result in an increase in quantity of bottled water demanded. So let's go the opposite way. Let's say this is the initial price of a bottle of water. Moving down to B will increase the quantity demanded from effectively from here to here. Those are movements along the demand curve. If we look instead at a change in demand here happens when there's an increase in the quantity demanded at any price. What happens in this case is you move the entire curve. So the demand changes from quantities and prices along this curve to quantities and prices along this curve. 5 reasons that can happen. Number 1, changes in the price of related goods or services. So if the price of coffee goes up, demand for tea goes up. We mentioned the substitution effect earlier, chicken versus other kinds of meat. So if price goes up of coffee, demand for tea will go up, and demand for tea, different quantities and different prices, but that entire curve shifts out. Second example, decrease in the price of lift tickets at a ski area increases the demand for hotel rooms. So let's think, decrease in the price of lift tickets means more people are going to go to the mountains to go skiing. That will increase the demand for hotel rooms at any price. So you're going to see movement from here out to here. Those are, again, examples of the substitute effect and the complement effect. Second, changes in income. A rise in consumer income increases demand for most consumer goods, what we call normal goods. So rise in consumer income will increase demand for smartphones. Rise in consumer income will increase demand for luxury cars. On the other side, rising consumer income decreases demand for purchases at Kohl's. That's the example I used here. Inferior goods, so purchases that you think people are likely to make more of when their incomes are lower, those purchases will decrease as incomes rise because they'll stop shopping at a place like Kohl's and they'll start shopping more at a place like Nordstrom. The third reason or the third factor that changes demand is a change in tastes. Rise in popularity of smartphones, again, as an example I used before, increases demand for iPhones. So popularity and consumer sentiment are big deals that we'll continually talk about in economics. The fourth, changes in expectations. Example I use here is expected release of the iPhone 5 will decrease demand for the iPhone 4. I was in the Apple store last week and I asked, just because I was going to use this example, and the woman that I spoke to said, yeah, we're selling fewer iPhone 4s because everybody thinks the 5's coming out. The fifth is changes in the number of consumers. So the example I use here, the increase in the number of consumers with cell coverage, meaning increased coverage around the country in terms of cell towers, increased dramatically the demand for cellular devices, so phones and other smart devices that use cellular technology. So those are the 5 factors that change demand. We talked about the origin and the derivation of a demand schedule. We talked about putting those points together. We talked about change in quantity demanded, which is movement along the curve, versus change in demand, which is a shift of the curve itself. We'll talk about this tomorrow in class. Then we'll go on to the next section, which will be a discussion of the supply curve. Have a great evening, and we'll see you tomorrow.